Have you ever witnessed the invisible battle that surrounds us each day? The one that most people never notice but that plays out in the silent chambers of our hearts and minds. Imagine a priest kneeling alone in a dimly lit chapel after hours, his hands clasped in prayer, his face serene in the flickering candlelight. Suddenly his expression shifts, pain contorts his features, as though an invisible force were attacking him. No physical assailant is present, yet something real and powerful seems to be waging war against his very soul. What you're witnessing is not fiction, but a glimpse into the spiritual reality that Saint Ignatius of Loyola not only understood, but mapped out with remarkable precision centuries ago. This moment reveals what many of us miss as we move through our days: the constant spiritual warfare taking place beyond our physical senses. Have you ever felt an inexplicable heaviness descend upon you during prayer? Or experienced sudden doubts that seem to come from nowhere just as you're drawing closer to God? These are not random occurrences, but evidence of the battle Saint Ignatius foresaw, a battle for your soul that plays out in ways both subtle and dramatic. Today we'll explore how this 16th century saint, whose own dramatic conversion came after being wounded in actual physical battle, provided us with spiritual weapons to discern and combat forces that seek to separate us from divine love. The attack on that priest during prayer illustrates what Ignatius understood with profound clarity: the reality of spiritual combat. When Ignatius speaks about discernment of spirits, he isn't discussing abstract theological concepts, but practical recognition of the forces that influence our thoughts, feelings, and decisions. You see, most Christians acknowledge the existence of evil in a general sense, but Ignatius goes further, offering specific tactics for identifying, distinguishing, and responding to spiritual movements within us. He recognized that our interior life is a battlefield where forces of light and darkness operate continuously. What makes his approach revolutionary is how practical and accessible it is, requiring neither mystical experiences nor theological expertise, just honest attentiveness to what stirs within us. Consider your own experience. Have you ever been moving closer to God, perhaps through consistent prayer, service to others, or spiritual growth, only to be suddenly overwhelmed by discouragement, doubts, or a feeling that it's all pointless? This is precisely what Ignatius identified as spiritual desolation, a state that doesn't arrive randomly, but often appears strategically when we're making spiritual progress. The priest in our opening scenario wasn't experiencing a psychological breakdown, but rather an intense form of the spiritual battle that each of us faces. The difference is that he, like Ignatius, had developed the spiritual sight to recognize it for what it was. Ignatius teaches us that the first victory in spiritual warfare comes not through dramatic confrontation, but through simple recognition, naming what is happening within our souls. The foundation of Ignatian understanding of spiritual warfare comes from his own dramatic life experience. Before becoming a saint, Ignatius was a vain courtier and soldier whose leg was shattered by a cannonball during the Battle of Pamplona in 1521. During his long, painful recovery, he underwent a profound transformation. With nothing to read but the life of Christ and stories of saints, Ignatius began noticing something remarkable about his interior responses. When he daydreamed about returning to court life, impressing noble ladies and winning military glory, he initially felt excitement, but afterwards was left feeling dry and dissatisfied. Yet when he imagined following the examples of saints, serving God and others, though the thought seemed challenging, the aftermath brought lasting peace and satisfaction. This observation became the cornerstone of Ignatian discernment. Ignatius discovered that by paying attention to the quality and direction of his interior movements, not just during but especially after various thoughts, he could discern their source and destination. This isn't merely positive versus negative feelings, but rather distinguishing between what he would call spiritual consolation and spiritual desolation. Consolation draws us toward God even when it involves challenging emotions, while desolation pulls us away from God even when initially pleasurable. For Ignatius, this wasn't theoretical spirituality, but lived experience. His conversion wasn't intellectual, but experiential, arising from recognizing patterns within his own soul. This same pattern of recognition is what helps us understand what's happening when we experience those moments of spiritual attack or resistance, like our priest at prayer. I want to pause for a moment and connect with you more personally. Have you ever found yourself under spiritual attack precisely when you were growing closer to God? That moment when doubts assail your mind, negative thoughts flood in, and prayer suddenly feels impossible? If you're nodding right now, please share in the comments with the words, "I've experienced spiritual warfare." Your comment might be exactly what another viewer needs to see to realize they aren't alone in these struggles. Sometimes acknowledging these battles is the first step toward winning them, and your testimony might help someone else recognize what's happening in their own spiritual life. Saint Ignatius would remind us that when we name these experiences, we gain power over them and create community in our shared spiritual journey. What Ignatius offers in his Rules for Discernment is nothing less than a practical manual for spiritual warfare. While many saints speak of spiritual combat, Ignatius provides tactical guidance based on recognizing the enemy's predictable strategies. Consider what he teaches about the timing of desolation. The evil spirit he observes attacks precisely when we're growing spiritually, much like our priest was attacked during prayer. This isn't coincidental but strategic. When we're drawing closer to God through prayer service or spiritual growth, opposition intensifies. Ignatius compares the enemy to a false lover who seeks secrecy and a military commander who attacks at our weakest point. Both images reveal profound psychological insight. The false lover image reminds us that temptation wants us to keep our struggles private, isolated from community or spiritual guidance. The military commander image shows how our personal weaknesses, whether pride, insecurity, past wounds, or specific temptations, become targeted entry points for spiritual attack. What's remarkable about Ignatian spirituality is its practical psychological wisdom. He isn't describing mystical battles, but the very real psychological and spiritual warfare that occurs within our minds, hearts, and wills. Ignatius understood that our thoughts and feelings aren't random, but often guided or influenced, and that by becoming attentive to their patterns, directions, and especially their after-effects, we can discern their source and respond appropriately. This is what the priest in our opening scenario was experiencing: a targeted attack at a moment of spiritual vulnerability that Ignatius would have immediately recognized. The story of how Ignatius developed these insights reveals another dimension of spiritual warfare: the battle against our own disordered attachments. After his conversion, Ignatius spent nearly a year in the small Spanish town of Manresa, living in a cave, engaged in intense prayer, fasting, and spiritual exercises. During this time, he experienced both profound spiritual consolations and terrible desolations, including temptations to suicide. These weren't abstract theological concepts, but lived realities so intense they shook him to his core. What emerged from this crucible was his understanding of how spiritual forces operate and how we can respond. One crucial insight was recognizing that spiritual attack often works through what he called disordered attachments. Not necessarily sinful things, but good things, loved disproportionately or apart from their relation to God. Consider how often our worst spiritual battles revolve around legitimate goods: reputation, relationships, achievements, comfort, security, even religious devotions that have subtly displaced God as our ultimate concern. This is what makes discernment so challenging. The enemy rarely tempts mature Christians with obvious evils, but rather with distortions of good things. A priest might be attacked not with temptations to abandon his vocation, but with excessive concern about his reputation as a preacher. A parent might be tempted not to neglect their children, but to find their entire identity and worth in their children's achievements. A devout believer might be tempted not to abandon prayer, but to measure their spiritual worth by comparing their prayer life to others. Ignatius saw with remarkable clarity how our enemies operate not primarily through attracting us to evil, but through distorting our relationship to legitimate goods. This brings us to one of Ignatius's most profound contributions to understanding spiritual warfare: the Rules for Discernment, found in his spiritual exercises. These rules aren't abstract principles, but practical observations about how spiritual forces typically operate within us. Consider his description of 3 typical times when important decisions might be made. The first is a moment of clear divine inspiration when God's will is unmistakable, like Saul's conversion on the Damascus road. The second involves carefully reading the movements of consolation and desolation to discern which direction brings lasting peace. The third, which Ignatius calls a tranquil time, requires more methodical analysis of reasons, motives, and potential outcomes. What's striking about this approach is its balance, combining openness to direct inspiration with practical psychological wisdom. This reflects Ignatius's own temperament: spiritual but practical, mystical yet methodical. For spiritual warfare, this means we fight not just through dramatic confrontation, but through patient, attentive discernment. When that priest was under attack during prayer, the Ignatian response wouldn't be panic or immediate dramatic countermeasures, but careful discernment. What precisely is under attack? Is it faith, hope, charity? Is it peace, patience, perseverance? Identifying the specific target helps reveal appropriate responses. This methodical approach to spiritual warfare stands in contrast to both excessive superstition about demonic activity and modern dismissal of spiritual realities. Ignatius offers instead a balanced path that takes spiritual combat seriously while addressing it with wisdom rather than fear. One of Ignatius's most important insights about spiritual warfare comes in his famous meditation on the two standards. In this exercise, the retreatant is asked to imagine two military camps, one led by Christ, the other by Lucifer, each calling souls to their standard or battle flag. What's remarkable is how Ignatius describes their contrasting strategies. Lucifer's approach begins with enticing people to riches, which then leads to honor and finally to pride. Christ's path moves in the opposite direction, beginning with poverty, which leads to accepting dishonor, and then to humility. This isn't just abstract spirituality, but a practical recognition of how attachment to wealth, reputation, and power gradually separates us from God, often so subtly we don't notice until we're far along the path. The genius of this meditation is that it reveals spiritual warfare as primarily about competing value systems that shape our choices in barely perceptible ways. We rarely face dramatic temptations to abandon God completely, but we constantly face small choices that incrementally align us with one standard or the other. The priest under spiritual attack might be experiencing conflict precisely because his values increasingly align with Christ's standard, creating greater opposition from the competing value system. Ignatius wants us to see that spiritual warfare isn't primarily about dramatic supernatural encounters, but about which value system progressively shapes our hearts and minds. The battleground isn't spectacular, but ordinary everyday choices about time, money, attention, relationships, and priorities that gradually form us into servants of one standard or the other. Perhaps the most practical aspect of Ignatian spiritual warfare is found in his recommendations for responding to desolation. First, and most importantly, never make significant changes or decisions during periods of spiritual desolation. When under attack, our perspective narrows, our thinking becomes rigid, and our capacity for wisdom diminishes. This is precisely when the priest should avoid making any ministry decisions, when you should avoid relationship decisions, and when all of us should recognize our spiritual vision is temporarily impaired. Second, intensify rather than abandon spiritual practices during desolation. The natural tendency when prayer feels difficult is to reduce it, but Ignatius counsels the opposite. When prayer becomes a struggle, that's precisely when we should slightly increase our commitment to it. Third, practice patience and self-knowledge. Desolation, though painful, is temporary and often reveals our hidden attachments or vulnerabilities. Fourth, remember that you're not powerless even in desolation. Ignatius emphasizes that while God may permit desolation for our spiritual growth, the enemy can never prevent us from using the weapons of prayer, charity, and virtue. Finally, recognize that consolation will return. Spiritual warfare has rhythms and seasons, and understanding these patterns helps us persevere through difficult periods. These practical responses reflect Ignatius's combination of spiritual depth and psychological wisdom. He doesn't treat spiritual warfare as something requiring specialized knowledge or authority, but as the normal Christian experience requiring practical wisdom, regular spiritual practices, and patient endurance. The experience of the priest under attack during prayer illustrates another key Ignatian insight about spiritual warfare: the intensification of conflict that often accompanies spiritual growth. Ignatius observed 3 stages in the enemy's tactics that correspond to our spiritual development. For beginners who are moving from serious sin to virtue, the enemy typically tempts through sensual pleasures and obvious attractions. For those advancing in virtue, the tactics shift to what Ignatius calls the angel of light approach. Temptations disguised as good, appealing to our virtues rather than our vices. But for those most committed to serving God, like our priest, the warfare becomes more frontal and explicit, taking forms like the direct attack during prayer. This understanding helps explain why spiritual growth sometimes feels like increasing conflict rather than increasing peace. The opposition doesn't diminish, but becomes more sophisticated and sometimes more direct. This is crucial for understanding our own spiritual journey. Many Christians become discouraged when spiritual growth brings more intense, rather than less intense, spiritual conflict. Ignatius helps us see this as normal, even expected. The priest experiencing attack during prayer isn't failing, but likely advancing sufficiently to warrant more direct opposition. This perspective transforms how we understand spiritual difficulties. What seems like evidence of regression might actually indicate progression. What feels like failure might signify enough success to merit increased opposition. This doesn't glorify suffering, but provides a framework for understanding why spiritual growth often coincides with periods of greater spiritual challenge. What practical lessons can we draw from Ignatius's approach to spiritual warfare for our daily lives? First, the importance of regular examination of conscience, not as a scrupulous accounting of sins, but as an attentive reading of our interior movements. Ignatius recommended the exam prayer, a daily practice of reviewing where and how God has been present, and where we've experienced movements toward or away from God. This develops our spiritual sensitivity, making us more adept at recognizing both divine inspirations and enemy tactics. Second, Ignatius teaches us the importance of spiritual direction and community. Remember the false lover image: the enemy prefers secrecy and isolation. Sharing our spiritual experiences with trusted guides or companions brings clarity and perspective. The priest under attack would benefit tremendously from spiritual direction, helping him understand and contextualize his experience. Third, Ignatius emphasizes spiritual flexibility over rigidity. Desolation often manifests as a kind of spiritual rigidity, where our thinking becomes black and white, our perspective narrows, and our capacity for joy diminishes. Cultivating spiritual flexibility, the ability to adapt to different spiritual seasons and states, helps us navigate spiritual warfare. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, Ignatius reminds us that the ultimate purpose of discernment isn't just avoiding deception, but finding where and how God is calling us to deeper love and service. Spiritual warfare isn't primarily defensive, but oriented toward a positive purpose, growing in our capacity to love and serve as Christ did. The attacks the priest experienced during prayer weren't random, but targeted precisely because his prayer was authentic and effective. This positive orientation transforms how we understand spiritual struggle, not as an unfortunate obstacle, but as an expected part of growth toward greater love. You might be wondering how to apply these Ignatian principles to your own experience of spiritual warfare. Let's consider some practical applications for common situations. Perhaps you experience sudden, intense doubts about your faith that seem to come from nowhere during prayer or worship. The Ignatian approach would first help you recognize this as a common form of spiritual desolation, especially when it appears suddenly during periods of spiritual growth. Rather than being frightened by these doubts or concluding your faith must be weak, you would recognize them as potential evidence of spiritual progress. You wouldn't make decisions based on these temporary states, and would maintain or slightly increase your spiritual practices, while remembering that consolation will return. Or consider how you might experience spiritual warfare in relationships. You might notice patterns where conflicts or misunderstandings emerge precisely when you're trying to bring more Christian values into your family, work, or community. Ignatius would help you see this, not as evidence you're on the wrong track, but potentially as confirmation you're on the right track, encountering opposition, because your choices threaten established patterns. In workplace decisions, you might notice how certain paths appeal to your desire for status recognition or security, while alternatives that involve more service risk or humility create anxiety. The two standards meditation would help you recognize these as competing value systems at work in your discernment. In each case, the Ignatian approach to spiritual warfare isn't about dramatic confrontation, but practical recognition, discernment, and steady, faithful response. This approach applies whether, like our priest, you experience explicit spiritual attack, or more commonly encounter the subtle, everyday manifestations of spiritual opposition. One of Ignatius's most profound contributions to understanding spiritual warfare is his recognition that the battlefield extends beyond individual experience to social structures, systems, and cultures. His famous prayer, the Suscipe, which begins, "Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will," reveals this broader perspective. True spiritual warfare includes surrendering not just our personal sins, but our participation in what modern theology calls structural or systemic sin. Ignatius founded the Jesuits as a response to the challenges of his time, including the need for educational reform, renewal within the Church, and engagement with new frontiers, both geographical and intellectual. He understood that spiritual discernment applies not just to personal choices, but to how we engage with larger social questions. This broader perspective helps us see that the priest under attack during prayer isn't experiencing merely a personal spiritual battle, but participating in a larger conflict that extends to social and cultural dimensions. Ignatian spirituality reminds us that authentic spiritual warfare must include both personal conversion and social transformation, both interior renewal and exterior justice-seeking. The principles of discernment apply equally to determining our stance on social issues, our participation in community, and our relationship to cultural values. This prevents spiritual warfare from becoming either exclusively privatized, focusing only on personal piety, or exclusively politicized, reducing faith to social activism. Instead, Ignatius offers an integrated vision where personal and social transformation are inseparable aspects of the same movement toward the greater glory of God, the magis that characterizes Ignatian spirituality. Another dimension of Ignatian spiritual warfare, particularly relevant to our contemporary context, is what he recognized as desolation, that masquerades as wisdom or prudence. Ignatius noted that when the enemy cannot tempt us through obvious vices, or even through distorted virtues, it might attack through what appears to be reasonable moderation. This takes forms like don't be too zealous, maintain balance, or be reasonable, not as legitimate wisdom, but as subtle encouragement to spiritual mediocrity. You can imagine our priest experiencing not just direct spiritual attack, but also the subtle suggestion that his dedication to prayer is excessive or unbalanced. In our culture, this form of spiritual warfare is particularly effective, disguising spiritual compromise as mature practicality. Ignatius helps us recognize that what presents itself as reasonable middle ground might sometimes be subtle opposition to the radical demands of the gospel. This doesn't mean genuine balance and wisdom aren't virtues, but rather that we need discernment to distinguish authentic prudence from fear, disguised as moderation. This insight helps us understand why spiritual mediocrity is so prevalent and persistent. The opposition to spiritual growth doesn't always appear as direct temptation to abandon faith, but often as reasonable-sounding arguments for reducing our expectations, moderating our commitments, and accepting comfortable compromise. This form of spiritual warfare is particularly effective because it appeals to our desire to appear reasonable, mature, and balanced. Ignatius doesn't call us to thoughtless extremism, but to discerning the difference between authentic wisdom and spiritual compromise disguised as prudence. As we've been exploring the wisdom of Saint Ignatius regarding spiritual warfare, you might be wondering about the practical implications for your own prayer life. Consider how Ignatius approaches prayer itself as a battleground where spiritual warfare plays out with particular intensity. The priest in our opening scenario was attacked during prayer, not coincidentally, but because prayer itself represents a powerful threat to the enemy. Ignatius understood that authentic prayer connects us directly with God, opening channels of grace that transform us from within. This is precisely why prayer often becomes the site of intense spiritual conflict. Have you noticed how distractions, thoughts of unworthiness, sudden fatigue, or urgent concerns about other matters tend to arise precisely when you settle into prayer? These aren't random occurrences, but strategic attempts to disconnect you from the source of spiritual strength. Ignatius would recommend several practical responses. First, recognize these distractions as normal, expected, even predictable aspects of prayer, rather than signs of failure. Second, prepare for prayer with brief preliminary prayers acknowledging your dependence on grace. Third, commit to specific times, durations, and methods of prayer rather than waiting for inspiration. Fourth, persist through periods when prayer feels dry or difficult, recognizing that the effectiveness of prayer isn't measured by emotional satisfaction. Fifth, use the structure of the spiritual exercises, with their carefully designed progression of meditations, to guide and deepen your prayer experience. The priest under attack during prayer was experiencing an extreme version of what all of us encounter in more subtle forms each time we attempt to connect with God through prayer. Ignatius helps us see that these struggles aren't failures but opportunities to persevere in faith beyond feelings or immediate results. A particularly powerful Ignatian insight about spiritual warfare concerns what he calls inordinate attachments. Those things, relationships, experiences, or identities that we cling to so tightly they begin to control us rather than serve us. The key to understanding Ignatius here is recognizing that spiritual warfare often operates not through temptation to obvious evils, but through distorting our relationship to legitimate goods. Consider how the priest under attack might be struggling not with doubts about God's existence, but with subtle attachment to the respect and admiration his ministry brings him. or how a parent might experience spiritual warfare not through temptation to abandon their family, but through excessive anxiety about their children's achievements and well-being. Or how a successful professional might face spiritual opposition, not through greed, but through allowing their identity to become completely merged with their career. Ignatius offers a revolutionary principle in response. We should not fix our desires on health or sickness, wealth or poverty, success or failure, a long life or a short one. This isn't stoic detachment or indifference to these realities, but rather recognition that true freedom comes from holding these legitimate goods loosely enough that they don't possess us. Spiritual warfare, in the Ignatian perspective, often targets precisely these attachments because they represent vulnerability in our spiritual armor points, where our legitimate loves have become subtly disordered. This explains why periods of loss, change, or transition often become intense battlegrounds of spiritual warfare, as the attachments we've developed are threatened or removed. The Ignatian response isn't to avoid attachments entirely, but to continually realign them, subordinating all other loves to the primary love of God. Saint Ignatius offers particular insight into the relationship between spiritual warfare and vocation or calling. The priest under attack during prayer was experiencing opposition precisely because his vocation places him at a critical juncture in spiritual battle. Ignatius understood that our deepest calling, where our gifts and passions meet the world's needs, often becomes a focal point of spiritual conflict. Consider his own experience. After his conversion, Ignatius initially believed he was called to a life of extreme asceticism and solitary prayer. Yet, as he developed the spiritual exercises and began offering spiritual direction to others, he gradually discerned a different vocation, founding a religious order focused on education, missionary work, and engagement with culture. This vocational discernment wasn't smooth, but marked by periods of intense spiritual warfare, as Ignatius navigated between competing goods and values. The key Ignatian insight is that spiritual opposition intensifies, not when we're moving away from our true vocation, but often precisely when we're moving toward it. This explains why making decisions about career, relationships, ministry, and life direction frequently involves periods of spiritual desolation, confusion, and conflict. The priest experiencing attack during prayer might be facing opposition precisely because his ministry threatens the enemy's purposes. This perspective transforms how we understand the difficulties accompanying vocational discernment. The struggle itself doesn't indicate we're on the wrong path, but might confirm we're moving in exactly the right direction, encountering opposition, because our calling threatens established patterns or powers. Ignatius teaches us to expect and prepare for this opposition, not to be paralyzed by it, but to recognize it as confirmation of the significance of our choices. Ignatius demonstrates remarkable psychological insight in his understanding of how past wounds and traumas influence spiritual warfare. He recognized that unhealed areas of our lives often become entry points for spiritual attack. Consider the priest in our opening scenario. His vulnerability to spiritual attack during prayer might connect with early experiences of rejection, fear, or shame that remain unintegrated in his spiritual life. Ignatius would see these not merely as psychological issues, but as spiritual vulnerabilities, points where the enemy can gain leverage. This insight is particularly valuable in our time, when we better understand the impact of trauma, adverse childhood experiences, and attachment patterns on spiritual development. Ignatius wouldn't separate psychological healing from spiritual growth, but would see them as integrated aspects of the same journey toward wholeness. What makes his approach particularly powerful is how he incorporates imagination, memory, and emotion into spiritual healing through the spiritual exercises. By imaginatively entering gospel scenes, experiencing Christ's love and acceptance in areas of woundedness, the retreatant finds healing for past hurts that might otherwise remain points of vulnerability. The priest under attack might need to allow Christ's presence into specific memories or wounds that have remained isolated from grace. This integration of psychological insight with spiritual practice reflects Ignatius's balanced approach to human nature. He understood that we aren't disembodied spirits, but complex beings, whose spiritual lives are profoundly influenced by our psychological development, emotional patterns, and relational histories. Spiritual warfare then includes not just resisting temptation, but allowing grace to heal and integrate the wounded aspects of ourselves that otherwise remain vulnerable to attack. Saint Ignatius provides unique insight into the relationship between spiritual warfare and community. His recognition that the enemy prefers secrecy and acts like a false lover points to the strategic importance of authentic spiritual community. The priest under attack during prayer would find strength not just in private spiritual practices, but in vulnerable, honest sharing with trusted companions. Ignatius founded the Society of Jesus not as a collection of isolated spiritual warriors, but as a community bound together by common purpose, shared spiritual practices, and mutual accountability. This community dimension of spiritual warfare offers several crucial advantages. First, other people often recognize patterns of desolation or attack in our lives, before we do, providing early warning of spiritual danger. Second, vulnerable sharing of spiritual experience removes the power of secrecy and isolation that magnifies desolation. Third, community provides living examples of faithfulness during spiritual difficulty, offering hope and practical wisdom. Fourth, communal spiritual practices like group prayer, shared service, and corporate worship create stronger spiritual protection than individual efforts alone. Fifth, accountability to others helps us maintain spiritual disciplines even during periods when motivation wanes. The priest experiencing attack would find tremendous strength in authentic spiritual friendship with others who understand these dynamics. This communal dimension of spiritual warfare represents a crucial corrective to individualistic approaches to faith that leave believers isolated and vulnerable. Ignatius understood that while spiritual battle involves deeply personal interior experiences, it cannot be effectively fought alone. The very structure of Jesuit formation, with its emphasis on community, regular accounts of conscience, and shared mission, reflects this understanding that spiritual warfare requires both personal vigilance and corporate solidarity. One of the most profound aspects of Ignatian spirituality is its understanding of consolation and desolation, not as rewards and punishments, but as different spiritual seasons, each with distinct purposes and gifts. The priest under attack during prayer was experiencing intense desolation, but Ignatius would see this not as divine abandonment, but as a season with its own spiritual purpose. Ignatius distinguishes between different types of consolation and desolation, some emerging from our own psychological state, others from spiritual sources. Most importantly, he recognizes that desolation properly navigated can produce spiritual growth impossible through constant consolation alone. Consider what desolation reveals: our hidden attachments, our tendencies toward pride, our vulnerabilities to specific temptations. Consider what desolation develops: our spiritual endurance, our capacity to serve without emotional rewards, our faith beyond feelings. Consider how desolation purifies our motivation, showing whether we seek God for God's sake or merely for the pleasure of spiritual feelings. Ignatius doesn't glorify suffering, but recognizes that seasons of difficulty make possible a deeper freedom and more authentic love than perpetual spiritual comfort could produce. The priest experiencing attack during prayer might, through faithful perseverance, develop spiritual muscles that constant consolation would never call forth. This perspective transforms how we understand the rhythms of spiritual life. Rather than interpreting desolation as failure, we recognize it as an expected season with its own gifts and challenges. Rather than desperately seeking escape from spiritual difficulty, we ask what this season might be developing or revealing in us. This approach doesn't trivialize suffering, but finds meaning and purpose within it, integrating even our most difficult spiritual experiences into the larger narrative of growth toward freedom and love. A critical insight from Ignatius regarding spiritual warfare concerns the proper use of spiritual practices and devotions. He recognized that even good spiritual practices can become counterproductive when applied inappropriately to different spiritual states. Consider our priest under spiritual attack. Ignatian wisdom would distinguish between different types of spiritual attack requiring different responses. If the attack comes in the form of scrupulosity, excessive guilt, or shame about minor imperfections, the appropriate response isn't more examination of conscience, but rather focusing on God's mercy and acceptance. If the attack comes through aridity or emotional emptiness in prayer, the appropriate response isn't abandoning structured prayer, but persevering with perhaps increased focus on service to others. If the attack manifests as overwhelming temptation, the response might include increased communal prayer, environmental changes, and focused meditation on Christ's example. This nuanced approach reflects Ignatius's understanding that spiritual practices aren't one-size-fits-all, but must be adapted to individual temperaments, current spiritual states, and specific challenges. What helps during one form of spiritual attack might be counterproductive during another. This wisdom emerged from Ignatius's own experience of the damage caused by inappropriate spiritual practices during his early over-enthusiastic asceticism at Manresa. where extreme fasting and physical mortification initially hindered rather than helped his spiritual growth. The priest under attack would benefit from this Ignatian flexibility, adapting spiritual practices to his specific situation rather than rigidly applying techniques, regardless of their effectiveness. This balanced approach stands in contrast to both rigid traditionalism that prescribes identical spiritual remedies regardless of circumstances and casual spirituality that abandons structure entirely. Ignatius offers instead a disciplined but flexible approach, adapting proven spiritual practices to individual needs and specific challenges. As we draw toward our conclusion, let's consider how Ignatius's understanding of spiritual warfare culminates in his vision of finding God in all things. While acknowledging the reality of spiritual combat, Ignatius ultimately offers a profoundly positive spirituality, centered not on fear of deception, but on growing capacity to recognize and respond to divine presence everywhere. His famous prayer begins, "Lord, teach me to be generous to serve you as you deserve," reflecting his understanding that spiritual warfare ultimately gives way to spiritual freedom. The goal isn't just avoiding deception, but growing in our ability to love and serve generously. This positive orientation transforms how we understand even intense spiritual combat, like our priest experienced during prayer. Such moments aren't just attacks to be endured, but opportunities for deeper transformation, greater freedom, and more authentic love. Ignatius believed that properly understood everything in our experience, even spiritual desolation and warfare, can become a means of drawing closer to God. This doesn't trivialize spiritual suffering or suggest that evil is somehow good, but recognizes that God's redemptive work can transform even our most difficult spiritual experiences into avenues of grace. The priest under attack isn't just suffering meaninglessly, but participating in Christ's ongoing redemptive work. This profound trust that God is working in all things represents the culmination of Ignatian spirituality, not eliminating spiritual warfare, but transforming our experience of it from fearful defensive combat to confident participation in divine love, overcoming all resistance. The ultimate Ignatian response to spiritual warfare isn't fearful vigilance but grateful recognition that even in battle we are being led toward greater freedom, love, and service. If these reflections on spiritual warfare through the lens of Saint Ignatius have resonated with something deep within you, I invite you to join our community by subscribing to this channel. Each week, we explore the timeless wisdom of saints like Ignatius, showing how their insights illuminate our spiritual journey today. The battles that Ignatius described, the ones that our priest experienced in prayer, these same spiritual realities shape your daily life, whether recognized or unrecognized. By subscribing, you'll gain practical wisdom for discerning the movements within your soul and responding with the spiritual freedom Ignatius sought to foster. You're not alone in facing these interior battles. Many sincere believers are walking this same path, seeking to recognize and respond to God's presence amid spiritual complexity. Your presence here, watching this video, is already a sign of the Spirit's work in your life, drawing you toward deeper understanding of your spiritual journey. Thank you for allowing me to accompany you in exploring these profound dimensions of faith. The experience of that priest under attack during prayer reveals what Saint Ignatius understood with such profound clarity: the reality that our spiritual journey unfolds on a battlefield. But it's a battlefield illuminated by hope. Ignatius doesn't leave us focusing on the combat, but leads us toward what he called consolation without previous cause. Those moments of pure grace when divine love breaks through all resistance within and around us. These moments remind us of what's at stake in spiritual warfare, not just avoiding deception, but growing in our capacity to receive and respond to love itself. The priest's struggle during prayer, like our own daily spiritual combat, becomes meaningful when understood as part of this larger movement toward love. When we apply the wisdom of Ignatian discernment to our lives, we discover that spiritual sensitivity isn't meant to produce anxiety or scrupulosity, but greater freedom, peace, and capacity for generous service. We learn to recognize the subtle interior movements that draw us toward or away from authentic love, distinguishing between what merely appears good and what truly expands our hearts. We begin to see our daily choices not as insignificant routines, but as meaningful participation in the great choice between competing standards, competing value systems, competing visions of human fulfillment. And perhaps most importantly, we discover that even our most difficult spiritual experiences can become occasions of grace when brought into the light of discernment. This integration of spiritual combat with everyday life reflects the genius of Ignatian spirituality. Unlike spiritual approaches that separate sacred from secular, Ignatius recognized that the battlefield extends to every dimension of human experience. Consider how he structured the Jesuit order not as isolated monastics, but as men engaged with education, culture, politics, and social challenges. This wasn't a compromise with spiritual ideals, but a recognition that authentic spirituality must transform all dimensions of human experience. The priest under attack during prayer represents just one visible manifestation of a conflict that extends to every arena of human activity. This comprehensive vision explains why Ignatian spirituality has remained so relevant across changing historical and cultural contexts. Whether we face the challenges of the 16th century or the 21st, the core dynamics Ignatius identified remain operative in human experience. The specific manifestations change, but the underlying patterns of consolation and desolation, attachment and freedom, love and resistance continue to shape our spiritual journey. This brings us to a final crucial insight from Ignatius about spiritual warfare: the recognition that our spiritual experiences, whether consolation or desolation, aren't ends in themselves, but signposts directing us toward greater freedom for love and service. The ultimate measure of spiritual growth isn't the intensity of our spiritual experiences, but our increasing capacity to love generously, to serve humbly, and to find God in all things. The priest under attack during prayer will ultimately measure his spiritual growth, not by the absence of spiritual combat, but by his growing freedom to love and serve despite opposition. This is what Ignatius means by the magis, the more the greater love and service that transcends both spiritual consolation and desolation. There's another dimension to Ignatian spiritual warfare that deserves our attention: his understanding of spiritual freedom as the ultimate goal of this combat. For Ignatius, freedom doesn't mean absence of constraint, but rather liberation from disordered attachments that prevent us from choosing the greater good. The priest under attack during prayer is engaged in a battle for precisely this freedom: the capacity to choose love, service, and fidelity, regardless of feelings, circumstances, or opposition. Ignatius understood that true freedom isn't about unrestricted choice, but about having our choices increasingly aligned with love itself. This explains why spiritual warfare intensifies as we grow. The stakes become higher as we progress toward authentic freedom. The enemy recognizes that a truly free person, one whose choices flow from love rather than fear, attachment, or compulsion, represents a powerful threat to systems and patterns opposed to divine purposes. The priest experiences attack precisely because his growing freedom makes him increasingly dangerous to forces that thrive on spiritual bondage. This perspective transforms our understanding of spiritual struggle. The difficulties we face aren't evidence of failure, but confirmation that our movement toward freedom matters enough to provoke opposition. Each battle becomes meaningful as part of this larger journey toward liberty of spirit, the freedom to choose the good, not from external compulsion, but from internal alignment with love itself. One final aspect of Ignatian spirituality that illuminates our understanding of spiritual warfare is his profound trust in divine providence, operating even through apparent setbacks, failures, and defeats. Consider his own story. After his conversion, Ignatius initially gathered a small band of companions with grand plans for pilgrimage to Jerusalem. When political circumstances prevented this journey, what seemed like the failure of their plans led to a radical reorientation, establishing the Society of Jesus and developing their distinctive educational and missionary approach. This pattern repeated throughout Ignatius's life. Apparent obstacles became redirections, leading to greater fruitfulness than his original plans would have allowed. The priest under attack during prayer might discover similarly that what appears as defeat or failure can become, through faithful response, an entry point for unexpected grace. This trustful perspective doesn't trivialize spiritual combat or suggest that evil is somehow good, but recognizes that divine wisdom operates at a deeper level than our immediate experience, transforming even apparent defeat into opportunity for greater love. The Ignatian response to spiritual warfare then includes not just tactical resistance, but strategic trust that a larger purpose unfolds even through our struggles. This isn't passive resignation, but active cooperation with grace, transforming battlefield into garden, combat into dance, opposition into opportunity. The wisdom of Saint Ignatius continues to illuminate our path nearly 5 centuries after his death, because he recognized with such clarity both the reality of spiritual combat and the greater reality of divine love that gives that combat its ultimate meaning. Spiritual warfare seen through Ignatian eyes isn't primarily about dramatic confrontation with evil, but about patient, faithful growth in love that gradually overcomes all resistance. The wisdom of Saint Ignatius continues to illuminate our path nearly 5 centuries after his death, because he recognized with such clarity both the reality of spiritual combat and the greater reality of divine love that gives that combat its ultimate meaning. As we navigate our own experience of these spiritual realities, may we, like Ignatius, grow in our capacity to recognize and respond to the God who seeks to be found in all things, even in the hidden battles of our hearts. Every time we face moments like our priest experienced during prayer, we stand at a crucial crossroads. We can retreat into fear, doubt, or self-protection, or we can move forward with the weapons Ignatius provides: discernment, community, prayer service, and ultimately trust in the God who accompanies us through every battle. The spiritual combat we experience isn't evidence of God's absence, but paradoxically confirmation of God's presence active in our lives, calling us toward greater freedom and love. What seemed at first to be an attack on that priest at prayer reveals itself ultimately as an invitation to deeper transformation. This paradox lies at the heart of Ignatian spirituality. What appears as obstacle becomes opportunity. What seems like warfare becomes the very path to peace. If you've stayed with me through this exploration of spiritual warfare through the Ignatian lens, I want to thank you. Your attentiveness represents its own form of spiritual practice, a willingness to engage deeply with these realities, rather than settling for superficial spirituality. This channel exists to accompany you on that journey, offering insights from the wisdom of saints like Ignatius, who have traveled this path before us. If you found value in what we've shared today, please consider liking this video and sharing it with others who might benefit from these insights. And remember that, like that priest at prayer, each of us faces our own spiritual battles, not alone, but accompanied by both divine grace and this community of fellow pilgrims. The wisdom that Saint Ignatius offers us through his understanding of spiritual warfare isn't confined to monasteries or chapels, but extends to every dimension of our lives. When we learn to recognize and respond to spiritual movements with Ignatian discernment, we discover new freedom in our relationships, our work, our political engagement, our use of technology, even our leisure and entertainment. The same principles that help us understand that priest under attack during prayer can illuminate the spiritual dynamics operating in a difficult workplace conversation, a family conflict, or an important life decision. This universal applicability reflects the comprehensiveness of Ignatian spirituality, its capacity to transform not just isolated religious moments, but the entirety of human experience. As we bring this exploration to a close, I invite you to consider how these Ignatian principles might illuminate your own experience of spiritual warfare. Where do you notice consolation and desolation operating in your life? What attachments might be limiting your spiritual freedom? How might greater attentiveness to interior movements help you discern between competing goods? The answers to these questions won't come through